Hello, chess friends, and welcome to Yazadov's Chess Channel, and welcome to our Basics in Chess series. So in this series, we're following opening principles, middle game strategies, and the endgame strategies. Today, we're continuing with some endgame strategies again, and today's subject will be the bishop versus knight endgame. And I've mentioned these ideas, how to play with the bishop against the knight, but today we'll talk about a very important subject, and I think you can reach this endgame very, very often, and I think you should be familiar with the main ideas, how you should play, and how you should create pawn structures in order to win bishop versus knight endgames. First of all, what we should notice, we should always create imbalanced pawn structure. We should create always asymmetrical pawn structures because they are very important to create. Then we can create a pass pawn situation. And the pass pawn situation is also a very important segment of the chess game because the bishop is, of course, for instance, like here, is long range piece, of course, and then it can control both sides. The knight is, of course, very good, very well placed. It can be centralized, but the problem is now we could create here maybe 3 versus 2. Here in this situation, we could create a pass pawn on the queen side. So this pawn structure would be also good, although we have a 2 versus 2 situation, but maybe we could create here a pass pawn on the c file. So at least we should create some kind of a pawn structure that allows us to create a pass pawn situation. So that's why I always like to mention that in my endgame strategies, that going into an endgame can be really a strategical element of the middle game. So that's why you should always consider when you play a middle game with more pieces, with many pieces on the board, you should always consider the option, could this game maybe go into an endgame, and could I create maybe a pass pawn situation? Because if these 2 pawns would be maybe here on the b file and the a file, not on the c file here, like this, then it's really hard to create a pass pawn situation. Then black will try to create some kind of a compact position, will try to centralize the knight, centralize the king, pardon me, and then he'll try sort of blocking, and it's really hard to win this endgame. This pawn structure is much better than maybe a pawn structure in which we had, instead of the c pawn, maybe here the a pawn. So let's see now a couple of examples and how great players managed to create this imbalanced or asymmetrical pawn structures in the endgame. So here's the gameplay by the legendary Wilhelm Steinitz, and I'm sure that many of us have reached a similar position like this. I'm sure that many of us played similar positions, similar pawn structures, and basically we had really troubles to at least create some kind of a dynamic position, to create some kind of an activity, to really force our opponent to do something, because we have the bishop here from black's perspective. Our opponent has a bishop and a knight. We have pawns on both sides of the board, but the problem is still this is not an imbalanced pawn structure. We cannot really create a pass pawn situation. So here Wilhelm Steinitz played rook to d8 first. He didn't want to take because then rook to b1 could happen, and then we could lose our b7 pawn. So that's why he played first onto the centralization idea. He wants to get his pieces first on the best square. Bishop takes a8 is, I think, not a possibility. We can trap the bishop with b6 here. So that's why c3. We have rook to e8. We have knight to b3, and now b6. A restriction idea of the knight is also very important in endgames. When you play, for instance, like here with the bishop versus a knight, and of course we have these 2 bishops, first we should really restrict our opponent's ability to play. So that's why b6 is very important. We should never allow this knight to jump on this very active square c5. So here we have h3, bishop to e6, rook to d1, and now c5. Again, restriction idea. Also not allowing this knight to breathe. Basically, this knight will never jump to d4 anymore. So bishop to g5, attacking the rook. Of course, f6 here. We have bishop to f4, and now king to f7. Also, very important segment of the chess game, segment of the endgame, is to play very actively with our king. So here, f3, we have g5, kicking away the bishop, rook to d8, bishop to e3, and now h6. We have rook to e1, and now we have f5, of course. Okay, still nothing is accomplished here by black. Still black holds this position somehow. But here I want you also to pause the video now and try maybe to search for ideas, at least for yourself at home. Try to see how we could maybe manage to win this endgame, because it's really not easy. As I said, we should target first of all weaknesses in our opponent's position, and I think in this particular position the weak pawn here is the pawn on a2, because the knight is a little bit stuck here, always to the defense a little bit of the pawn on a2. Taking, of course, on b3, and then after a takes b3 is not so good, because then the a file is open, and we could have some troubles here around the square a7. But even if we manage to improve the position maybe with a5 somehow, still it's not a problem, because white has a dark square bishop, we have a dark square bishop, and basically we didn't gain anything, so our bishop pair is not working. So here f4 was played, and of course we don't want to take here. G takes f4 is not a possibility, because bishop to f4 will happen, and then we'll have two isolated pawns. So that's why Wilhelm Steinitz played bishop to f6. We have g6, and now comes a5. This is the move that we've been waiting for, because we can really kick away the knight with a4, and then the knight has to retreat here to c1, and the knight is always stuck a little bit, as I said, again to the defense of the a2. So here knight to c1, we have a4. And even if white, for instance, tries here b3, I think we can take a takes b3, a takes b3, and then we can occupy here the a file. And I think white has lost the battle on the only open file, basically, although the d file is also open. But the good part about the bishops is that we can always restrict. We can play something like bishop to e7, and here like bishop to e6, and white will never be able to infiltrate with his rook on our side of the board, because he cannot occupy, for instance, the square d7, he cannot occupy the square d8, and if we play, for instance, bishop to e7, he cannot even occupy the d6. So this bishops are controlling this very important squares. And now, even if, as I said, white goes for trades of pawns on the a file, then you see we can get our rook very active. Maybe we can get it then further with rook to b1 and attack again the b3 weakness. So that's why it's really hard for black here to defend this. a4 very important to restrict again the knight's ability to play in the game a3. But now bishop to c4, that's really a nice restriction idea, because maybe white could search for some ideas, knight to e2 or similar, but then again we can occupy maybe here the weak d3 square. So we could also try maybe something like bishop to e7, and then push further with g5, b5, b4. So we could again create maybe here some kind of a pass pawn situation. In the game king to f2 was played, we have now g takes f4. What the idea about this move is of course, after bishop to f4, now to create, as I said, this imbalanced pawn structure. Now, basically, white is forced to trade off the bishop for a bishop, because if he doesn't react, he doesn't have good moves. He doesn't have good king moves, because we'll simply take, again, occupy here the back rank. So that's why I think here we have sort of a Zugzwang position, and in the game, white tried bishop takes g5, we have h takes g5, and here finally we have created this position. Although we have traded off the bishops, we are battling now a bishop versus knight endgame, but at least we have created now this imbalanced pawn structure, this asymmetrical pawn structure. We can create at least a pass pawn on the f file. That's the most important thing about this bishop versus knight endgame. So here king to e3, we of course move up also our king. We have h4, and although after g takes h4 and g takes h4, white has this so-called distant pass pawn situation, it's not so good, because the bishop, as I said, is long range piece, and here a rook to e8 was played. Here was simply trades of rooks, and now our king is very active, and here Wilhelm Steinitz realized this possibility that he can win this endgame, because he's much faster. Here after the move c4, we can go after this one, and now the problem is, now we have the move f4, which is very important, because now white is basically forced to go here with the move king to e4. If he goes here somewhere, then we can simply take, and we have a pass pawn. So that's why here king to e4 was played, but now we can move further, and again we can simply move further in this position. White resigns. So you see, it's not so easy in the beginning to win this endgame, but here I think Wilhelm Steinitz showed really great endgame techniques with, as I said, a4 first, kicking away the knight, then creating this situation where we have 2 versus 2, but at least they're not symmetrical, they're not in this parallel setup. At least we can create some kind of a pass pawn situation. Here's another example played by the legendary Bobby Fischer here with the white pieces. What we can notice again here is one thing, and it's this 3 versus 2 situation on the queen side. Although maybe when we watch this bishop's activity, this bishop on d1, and his opponent was, let me see, Mark Taimanov. Here the bishop is on d1, and here the light square bishop of blacks is on e8. The good part about this pawn structure is that we can create here a 3 versus 2. That's the most important thing. Although this bishop is maybe slightly better than Bobby Fischer's bishop, because his bishop is a little bit blocked out by its own pawns. Many pawns are on light square, so you don't want to have this kind of a pawn structure. We would love to have these pawns on dark squares, then the bishop could breathe. But here I think Bobby Fischer found a great idea how to play this endgame, because Black's defensive idea here is to create a blockade around the square e5. If Black cements maybe the knight here on e5, then it's not so good. This powerful knight cannot be kicked away by any minor piece. Basically, it can only be kicked away by the knight. And if we go for trades of the knights on e5, around the square e5, it's not so good. Then we're continuing basically the game with a bad bishop against maybe a better bishop by black. So that's why here I think Bobby Fischer found a good idea. Rook to c1, and after knight to g5, what black wants of course to do is to play maybe here something like f6, knight to f7, and then cement the knight on e5, and I guarantee you that you'll not be able to win this endgame. So that's why here after bishop to c2, we have bishop to d5, we have rook to d5 attacking the queen, queen to c7, and now comes this very important move e5. That's the move that we're searching for. As I said, we had basically here a 3 versus 3 situation so far on the queen side, but now we're creating again an unbalanced pawn structure. Here we have after d takes e5, queen to e5, and we can now further activate our pieces, but at least we have accomplished now an unbalanced position. We can create here maybe a pass pawn situation, which of course Bobby Fischer realized. He plays now a bishop versus knight endgame. We have h4, bishop to g4, knight to f6, we have rook to d7, and now rook to b5, attacking of course this weakness. Now we have c5. Okay, here Mark Taimanov took a pawn. He can take also another pawn, but now here very important move by Bobby Fischer. We have now rook to c5, and we have now created this idea, the main idea here, that we have now a 2 versus 1 situation. Here black has a 3 versus 1, but it's simply I think too slow, because Bobby Fischer simply pushed the pawn. Here we have rook to c1, goes behind the pawn and simply push the pawn further. We have a6. The knight wants to come into the game, but we can protect everything. And now it's time to march with the king. Here, after rook to d5, we have king to b5, and in this position, Mark Taimanov resigned. But what's the problem about this? About this pawn structure? Again, we can always kick away the king if, for instance, black moves the knight. But the most important thing is to kick away the king in order to get our king here to b6. When that happens, again, black is simply lost. But that was only possible because we have created this asymmetrical, this imbalanced pawn structure. We have created this pass pawn situation. Now we could really push this pawn and deflect basically all of the pieces, all of black's pieces to go to the queen side. You see, black didn't even had some time to push here the pawns on the king side. White was simply much faster. That's the beauty when you play with the bishop against the knight when pawns are on both sides. So here let's see another example. It's a game played by Milan Vukic against Evgeny Mokhalov. Here black forced this knight to move. You can maybe pause the video and find a nice simplification, sort of tactical shot, which allows again white to go into a 2 versus 1 here on the queen side, into a 2 versus 1 endgame. Here white took the rook, the knight with the rook to c6. We have bishop to c6, but now has of course the opportunity to get the rook back with the nice fork, knight to e7, and now knight to c8, rook to c8, and now rook to c1. Okay, still this is playable for both sides, but the problem is now the knight is too far away from the action. This bishop will maneuver probably here. We can play first f3, of course, fixing the pawn, and now maybe bishop to f1, attacking this, knight to c4, attacking also the d6. We can also play a3, b4, simply trying to again to create some kind of a pass pawn situation in the game. Bishop to b7, we have rook to c8, bishop to c8, f3 as I said, and now the king again moves towards the center. Knight to c4, bishop to e6, now bishop to c4, knight to d7, we have knight to a5, knight to b8, and now simply pushing our pawn further. Okay, we simply, as I said, we have this 2 versus 1, we have f5, h4, h6, f4. What we want to do here, if for instance something like e4 happens, then black has the problems that many pawns, as I said, are on the same colors like the bishop. We can still push our king towards the center, and I think we can even try some splitting moves, splitting pawn structure ideas with the move g4 in order to maybe weaken this pawn here. So pushing the pawn is not good here. That's why king to f6 was played. We have f takes e5, king to e5, but now knight to c4. We have king to e6. If again bishop to c4 happens, you see you lose simply this pawn somehow, because again black has to react. Black has to move with this pawns here. Here I think again we could go and search for pass pawn situation. We could try a4, a5, and I think in some occasions we could even sacrifice the bishop and create maybe a 2 versus knight situation on the queen side. This is also nice endgame technique that we could apply if this king, for instance, is too far away. If the king moves towards the king side, then we could maybe even sacrifice, I think, the bishop and maybe promote here one of the pawns. So that's why black didn't take. Black played king to e6. Now it's time again to play with our king. Knight to d7. We have knight to e3. Here bishop to b7, bishop to c4. You see how much easier this endgame is to play here for white. Knight to d5, and now bishop to d5, but we have basically the same position. As I said, still we can attack this pawn. We have now created 2 versus 1 against the knight. Again, this should be winning. We have g5, we have bishop to c4, again attacking the pawn. We have knight to b8, and here king to d5. We have king to e7 now. h5 blocking out here the position. f4, we have g takes f4, but now after king to e4, okay, we can again take. It's not a problem here in this position. Black resigned again. You see the problems now. The knight cannot battle. If the knight takes here, then the knight will never come out again. We can simply take out this pawn, go after this pawn. We can play against some Zugzwang motifs, forcing black to do something, but the main idea is probably to go after this one and create another pass pawn situation. But that's the most important thing. As I said, we should create 3 versus 2. Then maybe we have a 2 versus 3 on the other side, but we should also create 2 versus 2, but at least with the opportunity to create some kind of pass pawn situation. Then the bishop is of course better than the knight. If the position is too symmetrical, then black could go into some ideas. If you, for instance, have a light square bishop, then he'll put all of his pawns on dark squares where you cannot attack it. We'll try to fix the position, cement the knight maybe in the center. Then you don't have so many moving possibilities. So that's why this is very important. But it's very important to recognize that in your own middle game, because if it goes to an endgame and you have a symmetrical pawn structure, then you didn't take care of this very important segment of the chess game. So okay, I hope that you realized these ideas, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more studies like this, check out my Basics in Chess series, in which I created more than 160 videos about opening principles, middle game strategies, endgame strategies. Here's the link. And if you want to maybe watch the best chess games of all times, check out my best chess games of all time series. Here's also the link. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.